45 cadets failed the test. The human girl barely broke a sweat. The first one quit at hour 3. I remember because I was still on my second cup of thorn root tea, and the extraction beacon lit up on my console before I had even settled into my chair properly. Then another. Then 2 more in the same minute. I watched the lights blink on across the board like a slow, sad constellation, and I thought, as I always do at this point, that maybe this year would be no different from any other. I was wrong, but I did not know that yet. My name is Vel Shan. I am a senior proctor at the Galactic Accord Military Institute. I have been running the Crucible trial for 31 years. In that time, I have watched beings of extraordinary strength, intelligence, and courage walk into that wilderness preserve and come back broken, not because they were weak, but because the Crucible is designed to find the ceiling of every living thing that enters it. It will find yours. It always does. The only question is when. 46 cadets entered the trial at 3 in the morning. The terrain was Ether 3, a moon chosen specifically for its cruelty. Cold at night, genuinely, bone-deep cold, down to -20 standard degrees. Then hot during the day, 43 degrees, thin air, uneven ground full of loose rock, sudden drops, and patches of ground that looked solid until you stepped on them. No shelter, no map assistance, just a survival blade, a ration pack that would last maybe 12 hours if you were careful, and a locator beacon. The beacon had one function. Press it, and you were done. Extraction team would come get you. No shame in it, officially. But every cadet on that moon knew that no one who pressed it early had ever gone on to command a ship. The goal was the summit marker, a beacon on a ridge 40 kilometers from the drop point. Reach it. Activate it. Do that within 30 hours and you passed. Simple to say. Nearly impossible to do. In 200 years of this trial, 61 beings had managed it. I was about to add a 60-second name to that list. I just had no idea yet how it was going to happen. Cadet Lena Marsh was not the most decorated in her cohort. She had not scored highest in combat simulations. She had not broken any records on the obstacle courses. Her tactical exam scores were excellent, top 15%, but several of her classmates outranked her there too. When I reviewed the intake files before the trial, I noted her, of course, human, 19 years old, born on a frontier colony called Kepler 442b, which I knew only as a designation on a star chart until that morning when I started to understand what growing up in a place like that actually does to a person. I had not flagged her as a probable passer. I had flagged Cadet Doran Voss, a Dracori male, decorated twice already in his training years, physical scores in the top 2% of any cohort we had seen in a decade. And I had flagged Cadet Sileth, a Valorian female whose endurance numbers had impressed every instructor she had ever trained under. Both of them were out before hour 15. Lena Marsh was still walking. The first cold phase hit between hour 2 and hour 10. The temperature dropped fast and kept dropping. This is the first filter. Species whose homeworlds run warm simply cannot sustain function in those temperatures no matter how hard they push. It is not a failure of will. It is a failure of biology, and I respect biology. Both Valorian cadets went in hour 3. A Scythian cadet, one of the most naturally gifted trainees I had seen in 5 years, sat down on a frozen rock at hour 4, wrapped his arms around himself and pressed his beacon. He had covered 6 kilometers. In any other test, that would have been a remarkable result. The cold did not seem to particularly bother Lena Marsh. I do not mean she was unaffected. Her biometric feed was open on my console the entire time, same as every other cadet. I could see her core temperature. I watched it dip. Her body responded. Accelerated circulation, elevated metabolic rate, the standard mammalian response to cold. But she kept pace. She had covered 11 kilometers by hour 8. She was moving in the dark, navigating without her terrain scanner. I noticed that early, and queried it with my junior colleague, Proctor Davin. He suggested it might be malfunctioning. I checked. It was not. She had made a decision to conserve the battery. She was navigating by starlight. Not metaphorically. Literally using stellar positioning to orient herself in darkness, in cold, in terrain she had never seen before. I pulled her colony's educational records later that day out of pure professional curiosity. Survival curriculum on Kepler 442b begins at age 8. Stellar navigation is taught in the 2nd year. She had been doing this since she was 9 years old. The cold phase ended. The heat came in fast. This is where the Crucible earns its name. Not the cold alone, and not the heat alone. It is the shift. The body that has spent 8 hours tightening against the cold is suddenly asked to flip completely, to open up, shed heat, keep the core temperature from climbing into dangerous territory while the air around you turns thick and punishing. Most species can handle one extreme or the other. Very few handle the swing. 11 more cadets extracted in the first 2 hours of the heat phase. Several of them were among the ones I had expected to go deep into the trial. One of them was Cadet Soren Blake, a human male who had trained with Lena Marsh and by all accounts was the better athlete of the two. He pressed his beacon at hour 11. His biometrics showed core temperature spiking past safe threshold. He made the right call. It would have been dangerous to stay. Lena Marsh was sweating. I say this as a clinical observation because it mattered clinically. Human thermal regulation through perspiration is, from an engineering standpoint, one of the more elegant biological systems I have studied in my career. It is not pretty. It is not dignified. But it is relentlessly effective. Her body dumped heat through her skin, cooled itself, and kept her core stable at a moment when 23 other cadets were fighting to do the same thing and losing. She found a stream at hour 13. She stopped, filtered the water through her Blade Kit's mesh filter, drank deeply, filled her secondary container, and kept moving. She did not rest more than 4 minutes. I timed it. I was watching her feed almost exclusively by that point, because there was something methodical about the way she moved that I found difficult to look away from. She was not running. She was not pushing for speed records. She was simply moving at the exact pace her body could sustain, and she had clearly calculated what that pace was, and committed to it with the kind of quiet certainty that I normally only see in officers who have already survived a war. Cadet Doran Voss activated his beacon at hour 15. He was 6 kilometers ahead of Lena Marsh at that point. His biometrics showed the reason. His secondary cardiac muscle had gone into arrhythmia. His body had hit its hard ceiling, and he had the discipline to recognize it. He sat down in the shade of a boulder, pressed the beacon, and waited calmly for extraction. I have since recommended him for immediate commission. What he demonstrated in those 15 hours was exceptional. But he was out. 24 cadets remained. 1 human. I called a short review of feeds with the other proctors in the room. Standard protocol when the field drops below 30 candidates. We went down the list. Projected extraction windows based on current biometrics and terrain remaining. Professional, analytical, dispassionate. When we got to Lena Marsh, Proctor Davin said she probably had another 6 to 8 hours before her caloric deficit caught up with her. I said nothing. I just watched her feed. The second cold phase arrived at hour 16. The temperature began dropping again, and this time it was more dangerous than the first, because every cadet still on the field had spent 6 hours sweating in the heat, wet clothing, depleted energy reserves, bodies that had already been pushed hard now being asked to face the cold again from a weaker starting position. 8 more cadets extracted in a 2-hour window. One of them, a Dracori female named Veth, made it to hour 18 before she went down with cold shock. We pulled her out automatically based on the biometric threshold. She did not even have the chance to press her own beacon. She was treated immediately and was fine by the next morning. But her crucible was over. 6 cadets remained at hour 18. Lena Marsh was 34 kilometers in, 6 to go. She was hurting. I could see it clearly in the data and I could see it watching her feed. Her gait had changed. She was favoring her left leg, soft tissue strain. The monitoring system tagged it, probably from an awkward step on loose rock sometime in the last few hours. Not serious enough to stop her, but every step on it registered as pain. Her blood glucose was low. Her caloric reserves were essentially gone. She was running on what her body could dig out of fat storage, and the stubborn insistence of whatever it is that lives inside a human and refuses to lie down. She was also talking to herself. I turned the audio up on her feed when I noticed. She was not distressed. She was not ranting or crying or falling apart. She was maintaining a quiet, continuous conversation with herself, mostly instructions and observations. Watch the edge there. That rock is loose. Go left. Keep going. Come on. You have done harder things. Remember the 3-day traverse with Dad? You were 12. You were 12 years old and your boots were 2 sizes too big, and you made it. This is nothing. You can do this. Proctor Davin listened with me for a moment. Then he said, quietly, that she was lying to herself. I thought about it. I said I did not think that was quite the right word for it. She was using memory to reframe the present, telling herself that what she had already survived proved that what she was currently surviving was possible. It was not a lie. It was a form of reasoning. A very human form of reasoning. 4 other cadets extracted between hour 19 and hour 21. One of them made it to within 8 kilometers of the summit marker before his body gave out. He wept when the extraction team reached him. I do not write that to embarrass him. I write it because that is what the crucible does. It takes you to the exact place where everything you have is not quite enough, and it shows you that line up close. At hour 22, Lena Marsh was alone in the field. I have run this trial for 31 years and that had never happened before. The rest of the proctors had come into the observation room by then. Word had spread through the institute the way word always does in a place full of people who thought they had seen everything. They stood behind my console and they watched her feed and nobody said much of anything. She walked. That is all she did. She walked. The terrain in the final 6 kilometers of the Crucible route is deliberately the worst of it. Designers put the hardest ground at the end, on the logic that anything you meet at full strength is not a real test. You have to meet it already wrecked. Steep inclines, unstable footing, a narrow ridge crossing with a significant drop on one side. 43 cadets had activated their beacons on that ridge over the years, not because the drop was fatal, but because reaching it exhausted and cold and empty was enough to make even the most determined being decide that enough was enough. Lena Marsh reached the ridge at hour 25. She stopped at the edge of it and looked at it for a long moment. I watched her face on the feed. She was pale. Her eyes were underlined with the particular darkness that comes from 25 hours without sleep, and the kind of sustained effort that hollows you out from the inside. She looked at the ridge the way a person looks at something that they do not like but have already decided to do. Then she started across it. Slow, very slow. One foot placed carefully before the other, her arms slightly out from her sides for balance, her eyes on the ground directly in front of her, rather than the drop she did not look at once. It took her 22 minutes to cross 200 meters of ridge. I checked the time afterward. 22 minutes. Nobody in that room breathed normally for any of those 22 minutes. She reached the far side. She stood still for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly and kept walking. At hour 27 it began to snow. Ether 3's weather systems run semi-randomly. We set the temperature cycles, but we cannot control what the atmosphere decides to do with them. The snow was light, small flakes, not a blizzard, not dangerous on its own. But it was cold, and it fell on a person who was already at the edge of her thermal reserves. And it turned the last stretch of ground slick in a way that was going to make every step harder. She stopped, looked up at the falling snow. She said, out loud, to the empty sky, "Seriously?" And then she laughed. It was a real laugh. Short, ragged, exhausted, absolutely genuine. The kind of laugh that comes not from something being funny but from something being so absurd that the only honest response is to laugh at it. Then she pulled the collar of her thermal layer up around her jaw and walked into the snow. I looked at the room behind me. Proctors and instructors and admin staff who had wandered in over the last several hours. Every single one of them was watching her feed. Nobody was looking at anything else. An institute full of beings who trained soldiers for a living, who assessed courage for a living, who had spent careers learning not to be surprised by what the Crucible revealed about a person. All of them standing in silence watching a 19-year-old human girl walk through light snow on a bad leg on an empty stomach after 27 hours of one of the most demanding tests we had ever built. She crested the final slope at hour 28 and 40 minutes. The summit marker was 180 meters ahead of her. She stopped when she saw it. I think she had to make herself stop, because her body was on autopilot by then and stopping took a conscious decision. She stood at the top of the slope and she looked at the beacon and I watched something move across her face. Not triumph, not relief, not the dramatic emotion that this moment gets in stories about heroes. Something quieter than all of that. Something that looked like she was simply confirming to herself that a thing she had decided was true had turned out to be true. She walked the last 180 meters. She reached the beacon. She put her hand on the activation pad. She stood there for a moment before pressing it. Long enough that Proctor Davin, beside me, actually started to say something, and I raised a hand and he stopped. I do not know what she was doing in that moment. Saying something to herself, marking the moment, letting it land. Then she pressed the activation pad. The beacon lit up green. In 31 years of running the Crucible, I have never heard cheering in my observation room. We are professionals. We maintain composure. That is a point of institutional pride. I am filing this report with the honest acknowledgement that composure was not maintained. I met her in the medical bay an hour later. She was sitting up in the treatment bed, wrapped in a thermal blanket, IV line in her arm, eating a ration pack with the focused intensity of a person whose body had been waiting a long time to do exactly that. Her left leg was wrapped. Her fingertips had surface-level cold exposure, minor, treated easily. Otherwise she was, by every medical measure available to us, fine. I sat across from her. I had a datapad with official debrief questions. I had conducted 41 Crucible debriefs. I knew the questions by memory. I put the datapad face down on the table. I asked her how. She looked at me. There was something in her eyes that I recognize now as the look of a person who has been somewhere very far from comfortable and come back. Not changed in the dramatic sense that stories describe, just very clearly aware of what they are capable of in a way they were not before. She asked me what I meant. I told her. The caloric deficit by hour 14, the leg injury at hour 17, the core temperature readings through the second cold. I said she should have stopped. I said every data point told me she should have stopped. She thought about that for a while, long enough that I was not sure she was going to answer. Then she said her grandfather used to tell her that pain is information. It tells you what is happening. It does not tell you what to do about it. I wrote that down. I asked about talking to herself. She smiled, said she does that, said it keeps her honest. Said on the ridge crossing she had told herself out loud, step by step, exactly what each foot was doing, because it kept her from thinking about anything except the next step. One step is always possible. That is what she told herself. Whatever else is true, one more step is always possible, so take it. Then take the next one. I asked about the laugh in the snow. She said she had trained for cold, for heat, for difficult terrain, for exhaustion, for every variable she and her instructors could think of. She had not specifically trained for light snowfall in hour 27. She said it was so exactly the kind of thing she could not have planned for that it was almost funny. She said laughing at it was better than the other option. I asked what the other option was. She said, deciding it meant something. Deciding it was a sign that she was supposed to stop. She said she had gotten very good at recognizing that thought. The one that takes whatever hard thing you are currently facing and tries to dress it up as a message from the universe telling you to quit. She said she noticed it, named it, and walked past it. I looked at this young woman in a thermal blanket on a Colony Moon's medical bed, speaking about the internal management of despair the way a veteran engineer speaks about fixing a known fault in a familiar system, and I thought about something I had been turning over since I watched her cross that ridge. Humans have been in space for just over 200 years. We have been in space, some of us, for thousands. We built the first hyperdrive corridors. We mapped the first deep transit lanes. We have institutions and traditions and histories of space travel that stretch back so far some of us have forgotten what our original homeworlds looked like. Humans are new. They are very, very new. And they arrived here with something the rest of us spent millennia trying to build through technology and training and institutional process. They arrived with a relationship to suffering that I am not sure I can name precisely, even now. Not toughness in the simple sense, not the absence of pain. Something more sophisticated than that. Something that comes from 200,000 years of a species that had no technology, no medicine, no shelter except what it could build, no food except what it could find, no warmth except what it could make, and had to keep going anyway, in conditions that would have been the end of most species that ever lived. They domesticated fire, then they domesticated the cold, then the heat, then the ocean, then the sky, then space. And the whole time, they kept that thing, that particular relationship to the edge of what is possible, the one that says, this is hard information, what do I do about it? And then answers its own question by taking another step. Lena Marsh passed the crucible in 28 hours and 42 minutes. She is the 62nd being in 200 years to do so. She passed with a soft tissue injury, no caloric reserves, and a laugh in a snowstorm. I am recommending her for the highest distinction the Institute can confer. I am also noting for the record, because I believe it is professionally relevant, that I am glad humans are on our side. Not because they are unbeatable. They are not. They fail. They hurt. They have limits like everything else that lives. But they have a habit, a deeply ingrained, apparently species-wide habit, of walking past the point where the data says stop. And in my professional experience, that is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy.